space writer, and actually my favorite fiction space writer. So I'm really thrilled having them together to talk about moon landings, moon colonization, and I don't know what else. So with that, I welcome Jeffrey Kluger and Andy Weir.
Thank you all. I want to begin with a confession about Andy's work, which is that I read The Martian, and I was annoyed because it was so good.
Aw, thank you.
And then, not long after, I posted something on Facebook that said, yes, I just saw The Martian for the 4th time. Would anyone like to make something out of that? I don't care. I would have seen it for a 5th. It really was and remains a magnificent piece of writing, as is Artemis. And it's to the credit of the man to my left that we have this work here. Now, there are a number of things I want to ask Andy, and I don't want to monopolize because I'm sure folks will have questions. The Martian was about a charismatic central character, and it was about space and science. And it played out in space, and the driving dynamic was using science to survive. Artemis is space and science and a charismatic central character and a murder case, a caper. I said, it's a little bit, I was saying to somebody when we were sitting out there, I said, it's a little bit like Little Women and Gladiator, okay? You make that work. But how did you make that work?
Well, I mean, I knew I wanted to write another science fiction novel, and I wanted to write a story about the first human settlement that wasn't on Earth. I decided the moon was the obvious place for that. Mars is too damn far away, and low Earth orbit means you need to carry literally every gram of your city up with you rather than making use of local resources. So I wanted it to take place on the moon, but I also love crime stories and capers and heists. So I'm like, yeah, why? Who says I can't have just a caper crime story that science fiction takes place on the moon? So that's what I did.
And
in
you?
Artemis, which is available now, or on Audible, read by the lovely and talented Rosario Dawson.
And the 800 number will flash at the bottom of the screen now. Something else that I found interesting also, the whole central conceit of The Martian is that Mark Watney is alone. The book is a very populated book because there are so many people on Earth who are working with him, but our central character plays the entire storyline by himself. It's a one-man show. Artemis, there are 2,000 people is the number, correct?
Right, but I don't go into each one of them.
And that would be a good idea, because it would be a 13-volume set. But how was that different for you? Because you're painting a much bigger and much more dynamic canvas.
Yeah, it was a much more complicated story to tell. And, you know, I'm a dork, so I like math. Human interaction is much more confusing to me than...
Right.
So... yeah, how the characters interacted and interplayed and how everybody's working on their own motives. It had a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
And so it was much more challenging to write. And I often had to go back and go like, okay, wait, I have to change this stuff from like 7 chapters ago so that I can, you know, advance this plot line over here. And
Right.
it was a lot harder to write.
Well, just so many more parts. But you also tend to write lean. I mean, you can't judge a book by its cover. You can't judge a book also by its thickness. But this is, to me, for a book like this is how long you want a book like this to be. It's lots of time and space to get into the details of the story, but not so much that people's eyes begin to glaze over. Do you write to space, or do you do what so many people do, which is a 100,000-word book, starts out as 200,000 words, and then you throw a whole book away?
The latter.
The latter, yes,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, like, especially like all the research I did into the science, and like I designed the whole city of Artemis, not like the layout, but all the science behind it, how it got built, its history, the economics behind it. I worked all of that out before I came up with any plot ideas or characters, because I wanted a realistic setting, and so the plot has to work around the setting, not the other way around.
Right.
And the problem is, like, I'm really excited about a lot of this stuff that I came up with. I'm like, oh, this is the efficient sequence of steps for how you build Artemis. I could tell all about that. No, it's boring. That would be, it's awesome to me, but maybe not so exciting to others. And so only about like 1% of all the stuff that I researched ended up in the book. I have to be stingy with it. I have to say, like, okay, only tell the reader about this aspect of the science if it's pertinent to the plot somehow.
Right.
And that hurts because there's a lot of cool stuff, well, stuff I think is cool, that I had to leave out.
And it's another element that I wanted to ask you about regarding writing technical science that, again, doesn't anesthetize your reader. When I'm doing that kind of thing, whether it's for Apollo 8 or Apollo 13 or anything else I'm writing for Time magazine, my goal is always make the science just easy enough that anyone can understand it, but just hard enough that when you do understand it, you're proud of yourself. Hey, I got that science. Now, you are a scientist. You know this material. So how do you balance that? And where is your internal barometer that says, I've gone too far?
That's really difficult. I mean, that's one of the hardest parts is, kind of educating the reader on all the stuff they need to know for the plot elements that I've come up with to make sense. And sometimes I have to say, like, you know what? This is so complicated that it is better for me to abandon this plot idea than it is for me to bore the reader with all the exposition necessary to explain it.
Right.
And so sometimes I give up on cool, intricate ideas or things that I think would have been cool just because the setup for them would have made the book too dull.
Right.
So it's just all about trying to find the efficient ways to exposition it or sneaking that it's the same problem every writer faces with exposition, right? Finding ways to sneak it in such that the reader doesn't know they're being educated. Like, oh, they're talking about something completely different, and by the way, here's this, whatever.
Right.
And then that comes in important later.
Right.
But it's hard, yeah. And I have to put myself in the mindset of a reader. I have to basically change my personality and read it as if I'm someone else. That's another thing I'm sure all writers do.
Right.
And I have to kind of like tone down my interest in the raw science of it because most people aren't as into the nitty-gritty details as I am.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's easy to fall in love first and then say, now I must have to fall out of love with that scientific material.
Yeah.
You've also written both of these books. I seem to remember that there was one interview you did between these two books when you were talking about your next book perhaps being, light speed or warp speed or laser guns and all of that. And yet you came back to the near and plausible future. Now, I prefer that, but a lot of people don't. What is the appeal for you in that kind of science?
Well, it's kind of like the old adage, like, if you don't lie, you don't need to keep track of your story, right? Well, it's the same thing. If you use real physics, you don't need to keep inventing new physics to back up your made-up physics from earlier.
Right.
And so if you're just using the real world, then the questions I have about, wait, would this work, would this happen, can be solved with actual scientific answers.
Right.
For myself. And oftentimes that'll present new challenges for the protagonists that I hadn't even thought of.
Right.
That's one thing. The other thing is I actually did write a kind of space opera type of book. I got about 70,000 words into it between The Martian and Artemis. It was going to be called Jacques. And it just wasn't working. It was fighting me at every step of the way, and I felt awful. Yeah. When I was trying to work on it, I couldn't figure out how to make the plot lines come together or trim them down, and it wasn't going anywhere. 70,000 words in, I was still in the first act. And so I'm like, nobody's going to read this 800-page rambling tome, when I'm done. So I'm just like, I talked to my editor, and he agreed, the publisher agreed to let me hit the big red reset button
Yeah.
and write a different book entirely. And frankly, I think they were kind of relieved because they were like, ooh, yeah, we've been reading the chapters, and yeah, well, let's just say they agreed quickly.
Quickly.
So,
Yeah, when one of the best editors I ever worked with was my first science editor at Time, and I have a history of overwriting, and when I would get a, 400-line story, and the first 200 lines, I'd still be in my lead in the opener, and my editor said, "You do take a while to clear your throat, don't you?" So I learned a little bit more economy.
never use one word when 50 would do.
Exactly, yes. By all evidence, you are a male, and
Yes.
and will continue to be a male.
Inside and outside.
And inside and outside.
I'm cis.
And-
I admit. I'm
And
cisgendered.
And yet, your lead character is not a male. What was that like? I have never tried writing in the voice of a female.
Yeah, it was a challenge for me. I'm not a woman. And also, this isn't just like a female lead. This is a female lead in a first-person narrative. So
Right.
you're in there, in her brain with her.
Right.
And that was difficult for me. The reason I ended up with a female lead was because I went through several plot revisions and ideas for Artemis. And the first idea I had, I kind of outlined it out. Jazz, who's the main character, Jasmine Bashara, she was a very tertiary character. I just needed a kind of a funny smuggler character who's just going to be in like 2 or 3 scenes total. And so I went like, well, what's a country I haven't used yet? Saudi Arabia, and we'll make her a woman. Done. It was like that. That was literally as much thought as I put into it. And she had no backstory, no nothing. She was this very minor character. Anyway, that story idea, for reasons unrelated to her, it wasn't working out. I didn't like it. I didn't like where it was going. It didn't gel.
Yeah.
So I came up with a completely different story. I reused some of the characters from the first story idea, some of them in different ways, dropped, just like a rework of the concept. And this time, Jazz was more prominent. She was like a secondary character. I had to delve into her backstory a little bit deeper, but not too much. And she was still definitely nowhere near being the main character, nowhere near. But that story also, that didn't work very well. And I thought, well, this character here, Jazz, she's actually pretty interesting, and she's a rogue. Maybe I could make a crime novel, which this is when I came up to like, oh, I could make a crime novel on the moon. I could follow around this criminal instead of doing these other things. And that's where that's where I landed with Artemis. And so I found myself writing like this female Saudi-descended lead character, and I'm, neither of those things. But by then, she was so cemented in my mind as who she was that my imagination would have rebelled if I'd tried to change her to something I was more familiar with, like make her into a guy or something like that.
Right.
So I just I did the best that I could. I ran it by as many women as I could trust with the manuscript, because of course, for Artemis, the manuscript was like a state secret. I could
Yeah.
And so I gave it to every woman that I could trust, not to just turn around and put it on the Pirate Bay, right? And so it's like my editor, Julian Pavia, he's a man, but his boss is a woman. His assistant is a woman. The copy editor, I asked her to also, like, in addition to just doing copy edits, I'm like, please tell me anything that doesn't fit right, that gel is like the way a woman would talk or think or act. And, my mother, I gave her a copy, my girlfriend, and I took all their feedback, and I did make changes based on what they said. Yeah. Basically, I had to, research women.
Women,
I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, and so, orbital dynamics are easy, but...
Radically. A novel I wrote, the lead character, I told a friend of mine, the lead character is going to be a 13-year-old African-American slave girl on a plantation in 1863. And my friend looked at me and said, "Write what you know." Middle-aged Jewish boy from Baltimore. Totally different thing. The process for you as you're working on this, I think the ideal scenario, which never is what happens, particularly with novels, is you go into the book and you think, I know where this is, I have the roadmap, I have the armature, to mix that metaphor, all I have to do now is fill in the story. That never happens.
Correct, yeah.
How much of your story, even when you knew, okay, I now have my character, I now have my setting, Artemis, moon base with 2,000 people, and I now know it's going to be a crime caper.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's your first 38 words.
Right.
Now, where do you go
Exactly.
from there?
Well, I had to so I had a lot of information about Artemis already set up. Like I defined its economy, the city's economics and kind of like economic strata within the city were based on like Caribbean resort towns.
Interesting.
So there's the tourist section,
right.
and then there's the more like modest living conditions of the people who live and work there.
Of course.
And so I just based it off of that sort of stuff. So this is all just emergent behavior of human, civilization.
Right.
And so I started with that. And then I also realized, well, this is a place where there's practically no law. It is like very libertarian, and that carries with it a lot of disadvantages, like corporate espionage, company industrial espionage is like, what are you going to do to stop it, right? And money laundering, and so the crime aspect of things, how does that all interplay? And so these are all things that I could get Jazz involved in. But of course, then, I wrote all the way through the book and then gave my, first pass to, Julian, and he's like, why would the bad guys do this instead of this much simpler, obvious solution to the problem? And I said, and then I went away for
You
like
made that
2
noise,
weeks.
right?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
made that
yeah.
noise, and and it took me a long time to adjust the kind of setting and scenario and motivations to make everybody be rational actors doing what's in their own best interest and still have this story play out the way I wanted.
And speaking of rational actors, let's get back in a little bit to that idea of suspending disbelief. I loved the movie Independence Day, the first one.
Right.
But there
You mean
are,
the documentary? Right.
But the
I'm just saying President Thomas Whitmore's speech
yes,
was one of the greatest political speeches in
Right.
history, one of the greatest wars.
exactly.
Yeah, right.
And
Let's
if
give it up for
hasn't
President
happened,
Whitmore. Yeah.
I now need to live in a world in which that did happen. But on the one hand, I was willing to suspend my disbelief sufficiently to say, yes, aliens have landed and they have blown up half of New York. I was not willing to suspend my disbelief to say, and yet it would still take just 6 hours to drive to D.C.
Yeah.
Can't do that. So we do ask people in a book like this to suspend disbelief in some areas, even in outrageous areas, but we also say this would be a bridge too far
Yeah.
to assume that they would accept this. So I have to be honest within make-believe. How do you strike that balance?
Well, I've run into the same problems. It's like, I don't mind. You can break all the rules you want of physics, and I'm fine with that. I'm fine. Hang on, I'm fighting with my mic here, and I'm losing. There we go. I'm fine with suspension of disbelief. Things don't have to be like scientifically accurate for me to be happy.
Right.
Star Trek, you've got warp drives. Fine.
Right.
No problem.
Yeah.
I believe, right?
Right.
And but if they're like, yes, the Enterprise is capable of traveling warp 9. Well, there's one episode where they have to go from Mercury to Earth, and it takes them a while. And
Yeah.
I'm like, what? It's like 8 light minutes away.
Right.
And you can go like 128 times the speed of light.
Right.
Just get your ass over here.
Well, it was a school zone. Hold on. There
School zone, yeah. Yeah, and so for me, it's really about, if you're going to break the rules, you have to consistently break the rules.
That's right. Yeah.
And so that's a big deal for me. And then also, yes, the little details. It's like I can forgive. It's like, okay, fine. Spoiler for Star Trek 1, the motion picture. But
Yeah.
this Voyager satellite called Voyager comes back and it starts
Right.
blowing crap up and everything like that. Sure, no problem. I accept it. It got, some machine world powered up. It comes back and yeah, that's all fine for me. But then they say like, it has a power of 1 to the 12th power. I'm like 1 to the 12th, huh?
I don't even know. That's still 1.
That's still 1.
That is really funny. It's 0 times 1 billion.
Yeah.
All right. And yet there was
Plus
something. But there was. You also did that with The Martian, and I thought that I responded. I actually admired the courage and candor when people, and I know some people criticized you for this and said, well, with a 1% atmosphere, you really couldn't have that kind of windstorm on Mars. So your entire inciting incident actually couldn't happen.
Right.
And you said, yeah, but I had to get the guy stuck on Mars, so sue me.
Yeah, well, and I'm always pretty honest about that. I'm like, I knew that at the time I wrote it.
Right.
It wasn't a mistake. It was a decision.
It's
and and I don't really feel bad about it.
No, I'm glad because it was a good movie.
It was just a conceit. But I will say that I'm really happy because before that, most people didn't know that Mars's atmosphere was too thin to do that. And now I've like educated this whole country so that everybody can go, excuse me, sir. I think you and now what but I will say on that, I subject myself to that because I go out there and say like, I wrote a story that's scientifically accurate. I say that. That's my claim. So people are like, really? Yeah. Let's just take a look at that. Right. Nobody subjects, Star Trek or Doctor Who to like deep scientific scrutiny because they're space opera, they're fantasy, they're fun, and they don't claim to be. So I bring this on myself by saying, this is the thing that I'm doing. I'm claiming this is accurate. Right. So if I'm wrong, I've got it coming. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. And in a sense, actually, that gives people skin in the game. Because if I'm a 12-year-old boy and I read The Martian.
I thought you were a 13-year-old African-American girl.
I'm traveling incognito. I've got a bunch of passports.
Very well done.
Very well done. But if I'm a 12-year-old boy and I read The Martian, and then I think, I busted Andy Weir. Yeah. And Andy Weir knows fully well that he's been busted, but that's okay. In some senses, I think that's a cool thing for that 12-year-old boy to do.
There was a guy named, I'm going to get his name wrong. I think his name was Kenny Ray. And he, so when writing The Martian, I calculated even the orbital trajectories for the Hermes to get to and from Mars and Earth and everything. So I had like a spreadsheet where I could tell you the exact actual calendar date for every, soul on Mars and everything like that. And I'd mentioned that in a few interviews. And so it helped me with things like, the transmission time of radio at any given time because I knew the exact date, so I knew where Mars and Earth would be in their orbits and so on. And this guy, Kenny Ray, who was an employee of JPL.
Yeah. Favorite place in the world.
Like, used information in the book to calculate the launch dates.
Wow.
Like, and he said, like, I think the launch date is this, and I don't remember now what it was, but he was correct to the day.
Wow.
So I sent him a copy of the book signed. Well done, man. Yes, you're right.
And an invoice later.
Yeah.
A man's got to make a living.
Let's keep our feet on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. We were talking in the green room earlier about some of the challenges of writing. I believe you said that the northwest corner in your office was the one where you go to curl up in a fetal position.
Right, but the southwest gets good light in the morning.
Well, that's true.
So, they're both good for the whimpering and crying.
Right.
Yes.
So, but tell me about, it's funny, I was interviewing some astronauts the other day, and I asked them, what was your best day and your worst day aboard the International Space Station? So tell me the best day in writing Artemis, and you don't get to say the day I wrote the end, because that's too obvious. What was the best day you had?
I had this really, and I can't, I can't go too into detail without spoiling the book, but I'll say it this way. I had a really sticky plot situation. That thing that the aforementioned,
Yeah.
Yeah, that I was talking about earlier.
Right.
And when I came up with a solution to that, it ended up being a pretty elegant solution that completely solved the problem, and it solved multiple problems all at once and simplified some other plot lines. And I was just like, oh, that feels so good.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like pulling a splinter out. I mean, it was just like, oh, God, this is so much better.
That's wonderful. Okay. And what about the day the splinter went in? The worst day you had writing the book?
Well, yeah. Let me think. There were some.
If this is going to be a PTSD moment for
No,
you, we
no.
don't have to do it.
Well, the worst part for me was, I mean, it was before I started the book, when I had to throw away the 70,000 words
Yeah.
of the project that I'd already been working on.
Yeah.
And that hurt. It was the correct thing to do, but it
Right.
hurt. But that's not actually what you asked. I guess the worst was after that first rev, after doing all this work, and I'm like, okay, I think I've got it all together. The first batch of notes from my editor coming back saying, and I'm like, wow, he's got pointing out a lot of things that are wrong with this, and he's right on all of them. This isn't a difference of opinion.
Yeah,
He's just right.
Yeah.
And that, it just kind of, there's a mourning period.
Yeah.
and then you start trying to fix the problems.
My editor, the only agent I've ever had, when I turned the first part of my first novel into her, she said, I'm not loving it. And I thought, oh no! But she helped me make it good. So that's good.
Your choice of font is above reproach.
Your spelling is exceptional.
Yes, excellent kerning.
Yes. My wife once said to me about writing, especially if it's a novel, never go into a chapter without an exit strategy. It's a little bit like war. Don't go into Iraq if you don't know how the heck to get out. Do you find that when you go into at least a chapter, do you know what you plan to have achieved by the end of that chapter? And typically, have you achieved it, or have you wandered somewhere else that turned out to be better?
Generally, I have an idea of, these are the primary plot events that I want to have occur in this chapter, and this is where I want to leave it, such that they're forced to start in on the next chapter. Because I don't want them to be able to put down the book.
Right.
I want you up at 3 a.m. going like, that's my goal, that's my objective. But yes, I do sometimes wander off topic, and sometimes I'm like, this chapter's getting a little long, but I found something really cool.
Yeah.
So now we're going to rework things so I can have the coolness, but also get the plot advancement that I want. But I won't give up. I won't throw something away just to stick to a rigid chapter plan that I had.
That's exactly, yeah. Which is always the best way to go, because it is, when people say, well, the characters are telling me where they want to go, and I sometimes think, yeah, but they work for you. So, on the one hand, and yet, you do have to be flexible enough to say this book is going in this direction. And
readers are a lot more perceptive than even the readers themselves know.
Yeah.
They can tell when the author is railroading a character into something they wouldn't really do.
Right.
And the reader will be like, I'm not buying this.
Right.
And it's not even a conscious thing. They're just like, it just chips away at that suspension of disbelief just a little bit.
Right.
And so you got
they hear the machinery clinking.
Yeah,
I think.
yeah.
I heard that gear click, and now I'm reminded.
Now I'm like,
that this is an engine.
this isn't really happening.
Yeah. Would you? Your research is obviously impeccable, and your scientific knowledge is exhaustive. Would you ever, do you think, write a nonfiction book, even one? And there's some great nonfiction books that also have, great stories innate in them. I mean, look at something like Laura Hillebrand, Seabiscuit. It's
anything by Mary Roach.
Anything by Mary Roach.
Seriously,
a Mary Roach grocery list.
Yeah.
I would totally read that and get it optioned for a movie. But would you ever entertain that, or do you think you would feel too constrained by a world of facts that have to be adhered to?
I don't think I would enjoy writing nonfiction. I mean, there are a few things in the past that are really interesting to me.
Right.
But first off, the things that are most interesting to me have been covered. Things
Right.
like Apollo 13.
Right. Some
Maybe
also
Apollo
still available
8
at all
also.
fine stores. So
Yeah. And so there's that. And then also, I like to speculate.
Yeah.
I like to speculate on, what could be done with this technology. So I don't think I'd have I guess it would be much more of a slog for me to write nonfiction.
right. Yeah, one of the few advantages is that the storyline is there. So
Yes, that's
you
true.
don't have to make it up. You would have to be. I don't want to minimize the challenge it took to write Apollo 13, but that was a ripping good story.
Yeah.
It would be malpractice not to be able to tell that tale properly. What about space? Why space? Where is the charm and the love and the passion and the breathlessness?
Yeah, I don't know why I have such an interest in it. I can't think of a time when I didn't. A large part of it is because my dad is a space dork as well. He had this inexhaustible supply of 50s, 60s, and 70s sci-fi paperbacks that I grew up reading. So it's just always been in kind of the speculation about space has always been just a fundamental part of my imagination.
Right.
So it's my bag, baby. I mean,
If you were to write a science-based or fact-based novel, but you were forbidden by law for one book to make it about space, what would it be? Ichthyology, right? No.
Ichthyology?
Yeah.
Well, I actually did write like quite a bit into a serial about a mermaid.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Funny you mentioned that.
Yeah.
I would end up writing a science fiction story that took place on Earth.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
almost certainly. But if you say I can't write science fiction, then I would probably write a crime novel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you think you might come back to crime again?
Oh,
And
yeah.
for that matter, what's the fascination for crime with you? Because again, crime and science are such radically different things.
Well,
unless you get forensics.
I don't think that they are, because heist stories and like survival stories are essentially the same thing, a series of problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, here's a problem, and if you don't solve it, really bad stuff's going to happen to you.
Right.
In the case of a Robinson Crusoe style book like The Martian, your punishment is that you'll die.
Right.
In the case of a crime caper, your punishment is that you'll get caught and go to jail, or maybe even be killed,
Right.
whatever. But it's always still problem, solution, and that's I like writing problem solving. And in a way, it's really fun to write these things because it's kind of like writing a murder mystery, in that you have to give the reader all the information necessary to solve the problem themselves, and then you solve it, and they didn't figure that out.
Right.
So they need to see the solution and go like, oh, of course, and then but that solution has to be done with information they had at their disposal. Otherwise, they're not impressed.
Yeah.
So you have to outsmart the reader.
Yeah.
And my readers are smart.
Yeah.
So my readers are nerds.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's hard to fool nerds. Mark Watney and Jasmine have some things in common. I mean, they're very distinct characters, very different characters, but they have a smarts, and they've got an edge, and they've got a sort of winking irony about them. And that, I think, I was glad that you departed in many ways from the character of Mark to the character of Jazz, but you kept that intact. And tell me something about the power of that kind of temperament.
well, first person, writing first person in the first place is almost like cheating. You get to just talk directly about into the mind of the protagonist.
Right.
It's awesome, and nobody calls you on it.
Yeah.
You're just doing this raw,
Yeah.
naked, like tell, don't show, and
Yeah.
nobody's upset. But also a smartass demeanor lets you make exposition funny.
Right.
And if exposition's funny, then the reader will forgive you pretty much any amount of exposition.
Right.
The Martian is basically 300 pages of exposition and 60 pages of action. Really.
Yeah.
But and so if it wasn't funny, if it just read like a Wikipedia article, nobody would like the book.
Yeah.
So I kind of stuck to what I was comfortable with jazz because I knew there was going to have to be quite a lot of exposition in this book. And so for the same reason, I did first-person smartass.
Right.
Yeah.
First-person smartass. That is a new literary form.
Yeah. Well, but they are very different characters in that Mark Watney is based on me, but he's all the aspects of myself that I like.
Yeah.
He's all the personality traits I have that I like about myself, and none of my many flaws.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jazz is a little bit more like the real me.
Yeah.
She is very flawed.
Yeah.
She's immature. She's intelligent, sure, but still makes bad decisions.
Right.
She has a lot of regrets about mistakes she's made in the past. And she has a lot of maturing to do.
Yeah.
And that is basically the way I was when I was her age. And, I still have, some of those issues now.
Yeah.
So she's a little bit closer to the real me.
Right. I'm sure.
But
sure
both are smart asses, so
That's good.
I got that going.
Yeah. I'm sure you've been asked this before. I'm sure you've asked yourself this before. When you were writing The Martian, nobody was saying, I wonder what Andy Weir is writing.
Right.
After The Martian, everyone who read the book or saw the movie is saying, I wonder what Andy Weir is writing next.
Mm-hmm.
The sophomore season for a great athlete, the sophomore book or movie, that's a challenge.
Yeah,
How did you wrestle with that?
Remember that northwest corner of the office we were talking about?
Yeah.
I mean, it was a lot of stress for me, and really worrying about how well it'll be received, and it's just, it's very difficult. It's like that saying, I was talking to you earlier, it's like, give a man a book and you entertain him for a night, teach a man to write and you give him crippling self-doubt for life. I just had to set my sights realistically. I just said, like, okay, you know what? The Martian was like a success that a writer, if he's really lucky, will get once in a lifetime.
Yeah.
And so I just have to accept that, like, there's a good chance that I will never write a book as popular as The Martian again. There's a good chance of that. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to write any other good books.
Right.
So all I want is for people to read Artemis and enjoy it.
Right.
If they say it's not as good as The Martian, but it's still pretty good, then that for me is a win. But if people go into it expecting, like, okay, well, this better be better than The Martian, well, then I'm in trouble.
Yeah. And then also they're denying themselves the pleasure of seeing a second effort and seeing the different directions you're going. Yeah. At least that's what I tell myself.
That's what I
tell. This will be a somewhat treacly question. What about the children? And by that I mean kids in space. I mean, there is, I love the idea that, occasionally I've seen people speaking to a room full of kids and saying, the first person who is going to walk on Mars is walking on the planet right now. We just don't know who he or she is.
Uh-huh.
That's kind of important to get this generation, that generation. My generation was the Sputnik generation, for God's sake. We just had it in our DNA. We got to bring kids back to this. Tell me about how The Martian, Artemis, and your work in general will do that, or can help do that.
Well, I mean, so first off, when I'm writing a book, really my only goal is entertainment.
Right.
I don't have any sort of social agenda of any kind.
Right.
But I don't think it's really that difficult to get kids interested in being astronauts. I mean, that's a really cool thing. That's like saying we have to get more kids interested in being professional baseball players. It's really not an issue.
Yeah.
And it's not like we're lacking for astronaut candidates either. So, but STEM in general. That is more of a big deal. What we are lacking as a society is we don't have enough scientific researchers.
Yeah.
For it's understaffed at the national level. We have more need for scientists than scientists to fulfill the need.
Right.
And if my books, I mean, every now and then I'll hear someone say, like, oh, I read The Martian back when I was younger and it made me decide to go into this field. then that makes me feel really good.
Yeah.
But I don't consider it. In fact, I think it would be kind of arrogant of me to say like, well, I'm going to change the world with my story of a guy swearing a lot on Mars. It's just entertainment, and I think there's a virtuous cycle at play. Like, if entertainment about science is popular, then science becomes more popular, which in turn makes entertainment about science more popular. So the opposite of a vicious circle, right? A virtuous
circle. All right, the last question I'll ask you about policy, and then we should get more questions from the audience. We live in a counterfactual era. We live in an era in which we must persuade people that CO2 really is a greenhouse gas, that vaccines really do prevent diseases. They don't cause diseases. And there almost seems to be a kind of virtuous pride in, for lack of a less judgmental term, know-nothingism. How do we get around that? And what role can fiction play?
That's a really tough problem to solve, and I don't have the answer here for you today.
I'll be expecting it by tomorrow.
Well, in the grand scheme of things, there are always people. This is not a new concept.
Right.
There have been people who don't believe in the moon landing. There are flat earthers. There are 9/11 conspiracy theorists. There's all of that is and you go back a couple of generations. There were Kennedy assassination conspiracy theorists, or there were like Lincoln assassination. Seriously, you go back and people believe that contrails are chemtrails, the government controlling. So you're never going to eliminate that. You just need to kind of ask yourself, well, what percentage of the population believes in this? Right. And if it's low, you're like, okay, for some of the things, it's like, all right, if people don't believe CO2, emissions affect the environment, then, well, how big a voting bloc are they?
Right.
Okay. And if they're big, then you will probably find that it's less a belief system and more an economic need.
Right.
And it's less like that.
Yeah.
But, people who don't believe in vaccines in a few generations are pretty much selected against. So that problem will take care of itself.
You are Machiavellian, aren't you? It's just the science speaking.
I'm just saying that is not a trait that will survive for long.
It's the Darwin Award. I've often said to people who doubt the moon landings, I say, okay, so what we are positing is that 400,000 people who were involved in the moon landings have kept a perfect secret with no one slipping for 49 years. Nobody got drunk at a bar and tried to impress somebody. Nobody had a crisis of conscience and told his wife. Nobody needed the money and sold it to the National Enquirer. At some point, it's just easier to go to the moon.
Right.
It really is.
Well, no, Stanley Kubrick faked the moon landings, but he's such a stickler for authenticity, he insisted on shooting it all on the moon.
On location.
So, yeah, right. I did not make that one up.
It's a good one.
Making the rounds on the internet.
Yeah. And we should have more people ask questions than just me. So I see a hand way in the back.
There's lots of hands.
Hi, I was wondering if you could speak to the publishing process of your books, especially since The Martian took such an untraditional route of you self-publishing, then asking for money for it, and then getting the audio deal before the print deal, just how that compares to your experience with Artemis.
Well, Artemis was much more straightforward. It was a publishing contract, like from the get-go. I like working with the traditional route a lot better. I really did. Everything worked backwards with The Martian. Like you mentioned, I didn't ask for money for it, by the way. I put it on Kindle for 99 cents because they make you charge at least 99 cents. But no, I like the traditional approach a lot better. And as a rule, I love traditional publishing because the publisher has a marketing and publicity engine far beyond anything I could hope to do on my own. I mean, that's the real value add. They know how to they know how to get placement and advertisement, and they know how to get major outlets to review it, and that's all stuff I could never do on my own.
Okay, to your right, over here.
I see you.
I just had a question about, you're writing in the near future. Do you ever worry about the characters in your books? You make a lot of references, that they would be out of date to the characters in your books.
People mention that for me a lot. Well, in The Martian, I could get away with it because Commander Lewis had this weird 1970s fixation, which would have been about 50 years before the events of The Martian. So, but that's fine. In Artemis, there are some references that sometimes reviewers say, like, oh, well, they're making these references to things like, there's some references to Star Trek and stuff like that, and they're like, oh, come on, making references to Star Trek in the 2080s. I'm like, it's already 50 years old, and we still talk about it. So why do you think we won't be talking about it 50 years from now?
It's like Moby Dick.
Yeah.
That was written a long time ago.
That was written a
but
long
we're
time
still
ago.
talking
So,
about it.
Yeah, and Star Wars, there's also a Star Wars
Yeah.
reference, just a little bit of thing. They'll be talking about Star Wars in the 2080s.
Right.
They'll be on episode like 47,
Yeah.
whatever.
It's a good point.
I once saw Tom Clancy speak, and he was asked about turning his books into movies. And he started off very angry and frustrated about what Hollywood was doing to his books. But then he took a more pragmatic view, just get as much money as you can and then forget about it. So how did you react to the movie version of your book?
Well, I really liked the movie version. I thought they did a good job. So I am not angry, and I got a bunch of money. So so I kind of recommend that road.
Hi, Andy. Thanks so much for coming to New York, and I look forward to reading Artemis. I was wondering, how did you go from being a software engineer to an author? Was there something that inspired you to make that switch?
Well, I always wanted to be an author, and so when the time came for me to go to college and choose a career, I decided I wanted regular meals, so I went into software engineering. And it was later on where I was writing as a hobby, and I had been writing the whole time. I mean, The Martian was my third novel. The first two just weren't good enough to warrant publication, and so I just kind of kept working. If you do something long enough, you eventually stop sucking at it. And so I kind of bungled into success with The Martian. It wasn't a planned thing. I thought I was just doing it as a labor of love.
Two questions. How important is it to have an editor that is as knowledgeable in the science as you are as an author? And what would your English teachers say from high school now that you're a published author?
Well, my editor is here today, so I'm going to choose my words carefully. No. Actually, I think my editor would even agree that he's not quite as solid on the science as I am, but that's okay because he believes in me. He believes that I got that stuff correct. And he's also like extremely intelligent, so it's not like this stuff is like too difficult for him or anything. As for high school teacher, it's funny, if I can slightly adjust it to be a junior high school teacher, I had a teacher named Mrs. Forte in junior high school, and she, at the end of like 8th grade, and we all had our yearbooks and stuff like that, we give it to the teachers and stuff like that, she wrote something that I thought was really odd. She said, "Andy, I look forward to reading award-winning science fiction from you in the future."
Wow.
And at the time, I had no idea what she meant, because I would, dork around with little stories and stuff like that. And so I tracked her down after The Martian and sent her a copy, yeah. Here's the award-winning science fiction you were asking for.
Could you ask her to say that she looks forward to me as an NFL player
Oh,
in the
sure,
2019 season? Because that would be great for me.
It felt great, though. It's like,
all
"Dear
the way in
Mrs.
the back.
Forte."
all the way in the back.
Thank you for being here. I've read about a third of Artemis so far. Absolutely fantastic. So look forward to the rest of it. So
I hope you like the prolonged lesbian sex scene in the second half.
Can't wait. Can't wait.
I'm gonna go.
I'll read the rest of it tonight then.
Yeah. Okay.
So most of your fans, a lot of them are uber nerds and love the factual aspects of your work. Have you ever considered, hearing that your original version was so much larger, have you considered like a director's cut of your books? I know you'd at least get one sale out of it, and I think you'd get a lot more. So just a suggestion that we'd love to. We don't need an exciting story. We'd love to hear the rest of it. I'd buy it.
Say that.
But wait,
There's a reason things get edited out, and the stuff that got removed, it was removed for a reason. You know what I mean?
I would read it without judgment.
Okay.
I would have that contract ahead of time. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take one more question. It was someone right over here. Before I hand the mic over, this will be the last question. And then for those of you who have books, Andy will be sitting back there where the reception was, signing books. He'll be signing books for I do not know how long tonight,
Until
but
everybody's
he will be
assigned.
there. Yeah.
No, seriously,
Yeah,
until
seriously.
everybody's got everything they
don't
want.
need to panic. He will be there. For those of you who need to purchase books or want to purchase another book, the shop is right over there. They're ready. And if you're a member, there's a table in the back. And with that, our last question.
Hi, I have two questions. One is, do Artemis and the Martian exist in the same universe in your eyes?
I didn't define that, so I guess I could do that later if I wanted to. I didn't want to tie myself down on that one way or another.
And then my second question is, we talked earlier, so I'm the high school chemistry teacher, and I just want to hear your thoughts about how to engage students around, like...
You shouldn't get engaged to students.
Well, sorry, that's a teacher term, engaging students.
Sheriff.
But, engaging them around, like, your writing or science fiction writing.
I don't know. I mean, you just... that's a really broad question, right? You're basically asking, how do you make people like a book? Well... if you work that out, let me know, and I'll give you a lot of money for that information. A lot of people will. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes. So thank you. As she said, I'll be over there signing books. I will stay until everybody who wants something signed gets it signed, so there's no rush. Do things at your own speed. All right?